Hello and welcome back. This is the second out of 3 sessions dealing with Britain and how it is affected by the World Wars. This session is going to focus on the impact World War II had on Britain, and then towards the end we're going to be drawing a comparison between World War I and World War II. What I would like you to do first is I would like you to pause this video and define the keywords below. So conscientious objectors, DORA, land army and munitions. So pause the video and define those keywords please. Okay, hopefully you've all written down your ideas about these 4 words. We're going to go through what you could have had written down. So the first one is conscientious objectors. So I'd imagine most of you have something written down about these were the men who refused to join the army, crucially after conscription was introduced. So from 1916 onwards, conscription was introduced, which means that all men of fighting age have to join the war. Men who were conscientious objectors were the men who refused to join the army. They might have refused for religious, political or moral reasons, and they were treated incredibly harshly by the government. So the government punished them severely by either sending them to prison, sending them to the front line anyway, or even sentencing them to death. The government wanted to make an example out of these people. They didn't want these people to be seen as heroes, they wanted them to be seen as unmanly and cowardly. As a result, conscientious objectors were treated poorly by people in Britain. The next word is DORA, which stands for Defence of Realm Act. So these were a number of different changes that were brought in to change how British society worked. For example, newspapers were censored, letters coming from the front line were censored so they didn't give away any battle plans. You couldn't discuss military secrets in public in case there were spies around. The government had the right to seize any land it wanted for the war effort, and you couldn't waste food that is fit for human consumption on animals because they were concerned with the food shortages during the First World War. The next 2 keywords, land army and munitions, both relate to women's work during the war. So the land army is where women would farm the fields to help keep the country fed, and munitions refers to women going into factories to make weapons for the war, and the propaganda poster on the right is an example of a poster that was used to promote munitions work for women during the First World War. Okay, so how were women affected by the Second World War? The way women's lives changed in the Second World War is very similar to how they changed in the First World War. Again, because all the men had gone off to fight, there was a gap in lots of different industries that the women had to fill. So they went back into the munitions factories to work. They rejoined the land army to farm the fields, which was even more crucial in the Second World War, as we'll go on to find out when we look at rationing. And you've got nurses in field hospitals. Propaganda again is used to target women to make them fulfil their patriotic duty to fight in this war. So the poster on the right is an excellent example of it. It says, "Women of Britain, come into the factories, ask at any employment exchange for advice and other details." Full details, sorry. So this poster here is showing a woman with her arms open, basically helping the war effort, and you can see maybe one of the only differences between women's work in the Second World War and First World War is that you've got planes flying over this factory. So the idea of this is the work the women are doing in these factories is helping these planes fly to defend Britain. Aircraft fighting, so the RAF, this was founded in the Second World War because in the First World War they did not have the technology to be fighting with planes, whereas in the Second World War it's very crucial to how Britain fought the war. In the Second World War, Britain is pushed back from mainland Europe and they're defending their island. The main way to defend the island is to use planes to fly overhead and to shoot down any German planes that are trying to bomb Britain. So planes were crucial to the war effort, and this poster is showing that this woman is crucial to the war effort because she is helping to build these planes that are defending the country. Okay, so we're moving on to rationing now. Rationing was used in the First World War. It was brought in 1918, so in the final year of the war, rationing was introduced for the First World War, whereas in the Second World War it is brought in from the beginning. Since the Battle of the Atlantic, it is very hard to ship any food from America to Britain, and Britain gets a lot of its food from overseas. So the fact that the German army can just sink any ship that has British food on it is a massive problem for keeping the country fed. So rationing is brought in right at the beginning of the war. Everyone is issued with a ration book, so you can see an example of some of these ration books that existed during the First World War. They would have a little piece of paper that entitle you to different products of food. So you'd have little piece of paper for your butter, meat, eggs, milk, anything along those lines that you had to hand over in exchange for your food. It made sure that the food was distributed evenly amongst everyone in the country. The British government didn't want a situation where the rich bought up all the food in the country and the poor were starving and couldn't afford to feed themselves. So this ration book was brought in to help that. As you can see in the image, rationing wasn't just for food, it was also for clothing. So people were encouraged to make do and mend with the clothes they already had. So they were encouraged to repair the clothing they had to save on materials that could be used for other purposes. To support the rationing on food, there was lots of propaganda posters encouraging people to dig for victory. So to have their own allotments, to have their own gardens where they were going to grow food to support their families. So there wasn't a limit on vegetables, so you could eat as many vegetables as you could grow basically. So they were encouraging the ordinary British person to get out there and start growing their own food. This change did not just exist during the Second World War, it lasted up until 1954. So it took such a long time to resupply the country after the war was over. It was a whole 9 years after the war had finished that rationing ended. You can actually see in the image that the two pale ration books at the front are for the years 1953 to 1954. So rationing was used for a long period in Britain to try and keep the country fed during the war and afterwards until 1954. The Blitz is something unique to the Second World War, so it is something that a lot of people think of when you think of the Second World War. These images of bombed out towns due to German air raids. So Britain had been pushed back from mainland Europe by the Nazis because the Nazi army was too strong for them. So Britain had retreated back to their island and were defending their country from there. So it's not like the First World War where they're fighting in trenches. The British aren't fighting a massive campaign in mainland Europe, they're focusing on defending their island. Germany began a bombing campaign of Britain in September 1940 to try and make Britain surrender in the Second World War. The Germans targeted major industrial towns such as London, Bristol, Birmingham, Newcastle. You will have heard about Newcastle if you've been doing the project book that we set earlier in the year, that it was the shipbuilding yards that were targeted. Obviously you want ships so that you can transport goods around the country or soldiers to Europe to try and help out, and if those were bombed it might put you out of the war. So Newcastle was an area that was targeted by the Nazis. Britain had a very good system of radar, so this meant they could detect when a plane was coming into the airspace over Britain. Once they had detected a German plane coming into British airspace, they would send out an alert and an air raid siren would sound to let the people know that there was an air raid coming. People would go into shelters for their own safety. So the ones that were in the streets were called Anderson shelters, and they would go there to make sure that they were safe during the bombing. A lot of people would come back out of the air raid shelters when the all clear had sounded, and only then would they know if their house had survived the bombing. As you can see in the image, a lot of cities were destroyed and damaged heavily by the Second World War Blitz. Due to the intense Blitz campaign that the Nazis were conducting over Britain, evacuation was introduced by the British government. So evacuation just means leaving an area, and the people who were evacuated were mainly children from the major cities, and they were sent out to the countryside for their own safety. So the countryside was far less likely to be targeted by the Nazis, so they thought to protect the children they would send them out to the countryside. Once they were in the countryside, they would be taken in by a local family and they'd be looked after by them. There's lots of happy stories of people really enjoying the countryside. So it was the first time a lot of children from the city had seen cows, for example. They were a bit unsure about what they were. They might have really enjoyed playing in the open fields. It was a lot cleaner, the air was a lot fresher out in the countryside. They might have had a bit more in terms of variety in their diet, because generally in the countryside you've got more farms, so people are going to be growing more of their own crops. Some children, however, were really homesick and would try and escape from the countryside and come back into the cities to rejoin their families. A fun fact is that students who attended St Cuthbert's Catholic High School during the Second World War were actually evacuated to Cumbria, which is on the other side of the country, which is sort of where Carlisle is. So students who lived near the school and attended that school were evacuated to the countryside because it was seen to be unsafe to be in that part of Newcastle whilst the Blitz was going on. Okay, now that we've looked at different changes that happened in Britain during the Second World War, what we're going to do now is we're going to start comparing it to what we looked at last time with the First World War. So I've got a Venn diagram on my screen. What I would like you to do is draw out your own Venn diagram with World War I on one side and World War II on the other. You need to leave a bit of a gap in the middle as well so that you can get some ideas into the middle. We should know how Venn diagram works, but in case we're a little bit rusty, you've got the area where the two circles overlap is something that is the same for both of them. And if it's just in the grey circle, it's World War I. If it's just in the purple circle, it just belongs to World War II. I've put 4 ideas down the side to get you started. What I would like you to do is pause this video, draw out your Venn diagram and put these 4 bullet points into the section of the Venn diagram you think they belong in. And then you can unpause and see if you've got it right. Okay, so now you should have your own Venn diagram and you can compare where you put your answers to where they are on the screen. So the first one is the Women's Land Army. That existed in both the First World War and the Second World War. So in both wars, the land girls were required to go out into the countryside and farm the land. We've got rationing, again, that is in both. Yes, it was more common and more consistently used through the Second World War, but it did also exist at the end of the First World War in 1918. And then you've got DORA, which you should remember stands for Defence of the Realm Act. That is just something that exists in the First World War. And then in World War II, you've got evacuation of children. So there was no bombing campaign of Britain in the First World War because planes weren't that sophisticated. So the evacuation of children was just in the Second World War. Now that you've sorted my ideas, what I'd like you to do is put your own ideas in there. So anything else that we've not covered yet, I would like you to try and put that into the Venn diagram. You might want to think about where would the Blitz go? Where would munitions work for women go? All these different ideas we've looked at, I would like you to populate your Venn diagram with your own ideas. Now that we have compared the impact of World War I and World War II on the British home front, what we are going to do is we are going to write that up into an answer. So this is an example of a question that asks you to compare both the First World War and the Second World War. So the question says, explain one way in which the home front was similar during World War I and World War II. This question would be worth 4 marks, so that gives you an idea of how much you need to write. It's not much at all, it is just 1 paragraph we are asking for. What you need to do in this question is dead simple. You just need to identify one thing that is the same between World War I and World War II. So look at your Venn diagram and look in the middle section and pick one of those things that is the same from the First and the Second World War. Once you've picked your similarity, you need to give an example from each time period to support your similarity. So you need to give me a little detail from World War I and a little detail from World War II to support the idea that there is something the same between these 2 wars. What I would like you to do is I would like you to pause this video and give yourself 5 minutes to write up your response to this question. So pause the video, 5 minutes, write up your response to the question. Now you should have in front of you your own paragraph that you've written. I've got a model answer here that we are just going to go through, and you can compare your answer to the one I have given here. So the question, just to remind us, was explain one way in which the home front was similar during World War One and World War Two. So we're just going to read through the answer and then pick out why this is a good response. So you can see here that it's quite a short answer. In fact, it's only 3 sentences long. I've done everything I need to in 3 sentences. So it shows you don't have to write much to get 4 out of 4 on this question. Okay, it says, one way the home front was similar in World War One and World War Two was that women were participating in war work. For example, in World War One, women worked in munitions factories making shells and bombs for the war effort. This is similar to the work they did in World War II, where women would work in munitions factories, helping to build planes and other modern weapons that were used in the war. So that first sentence there, I've immediately identified my similarity. I've gone straight in and answered the question. I said the similarity is that women were involved in the war. So if you have not done that in your first sentence, I would recommend going back and adding that in, because if you do it in your first sentence, it is very clear that you are answering the question. The second sentence, I have given my detail from the First World War. I said that women worked in munitions factories making shells and bombs. So I've given my own knowledge about the First World War and what women did to help with the war effort. The final sentence, I've begun it with a really good sentence starter. So I've got, this is similar. So it's very clear that I'm comparing the 2 world wars. So I'm using the language of the question to answer, because it's showing that I've understood what this person wants me to say for this question. So I've said this is similar to the work they did in World War II, where women would work in munitions factories, and rather than being repetitive, I've said they've helped build planes. So remember, we mentioned earlier that in the Second World War, planes are used more heavily by both the Nazis and by the British, so planes are a main focus of women in the munitions factories. So I have given my similarity and used an example from each of the time periods to make my point. This is not by any means the only example you could have given. You could have said your similarity is that rationing was used in both of the wars. That could have been a really good similarity to say. You could have talked about women in the war, but you could have used the land army as your example, or even nurses as your example. So there's lots of different similarities between the First and the Second World War. This is the end of the second session. The third one is going to look at how Britain changed after the war ended. I hope you all stay safe and look forward to seeing you all back at school in September.